And I think we're gonna have a really good time.
Okay, so why don't I start? Let me start by asking people to introduce themselves, since I only know a couple of you. Maybe we could, Daniel?
Oh, sure. Well, I run the club for another month or so before it gets kicked off to the next year's e-board. Jurgen's going to be vice president. Yeah, I'm a philosophy major, finishing up. Had a lot of fun here in the program. Yeah.
Okay. Amy?
Hi, I'm Amy. I graduated from Rutgers last year, class of 2019. I majored in English, but I double minored in philosophy and comparative literature.
Ethan?
Hi, I'm an undergraduate studying philosophy at Columbia University, and I'm a friend of Jurgen's. He invited me.
Scott?
All right, hey guys, I'm Scott. I just graduated in January of 2020. I was a linguistics major and philosophy minor, and kind of figuring out my next steps, but still enjoying attending philosophy club.
Cool. Von Rossi. Wow.
Hey, what's up? How's it going? Good.
You look like you're working at IKEA or something in the background.
I'm working for the city Department of Transportation. Normally I'm a bus operator, but right now but right now I'm on my lunch break. I graduated Rutgers last year with Amy.
Joseph Worslow.
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm a part-time student at Rutgers. My favorite topic's metaphysics, but very interested to hear what you have to say today about Heidegger and literature.
Cool. The next person, I don't see a name. So the person between Joe and Daniel. Joe, no? There you just shifted positions there. Whoever's next would like to introduce him or herself.
Hi, I'm Sam.
That's it, Sam Weiner.
Oh, hi. Hi, I'm a junior philosophy major. I'm also taking German right now.
Cool.
I've taken a course at a different university about being in time. And so I'm definitely into more Heidegger.
Cool, cool. Daniel, you there? Daniel Wasserman?
Yeah, hi. I'm a sophomore and more into the continental side of things. And this is my first experience with Heidegger, so I'm definitely interested in this.
Okay, great. Eric, with a K? CK? I think we're having technical difficulties with Eric. Let's move on to Matthew Rotolo.
Hi, Professor. I'm actually an alum. I graduated last year, so I'm just sitting in on the Zoom talks, but I really like Heidegger's work in existentialism, so I'm looking forward to your conversation today.
Cool, cool. Okay, let's get started. Background, as Jurgen suggested, is usually I work between literature and philosophy and often psychoanalysis. And I started teaching Heidegger about 6 years ago when David Krell, who actually is the translator of the text you read and is the editor of Heidegger's basic writings, came to Rutgers to do a series of seminars. And I thought, if ever I'm going to really, in the context of David Krell's talks. And so together we designed a syllabus which was primarily around being in time and around the question of ecstasy and ecstatic temporality. And in conjunction with the Heidegger, we read Hölderlin and Aristotle, Hölderlin and Aristotle, Hannah Arendt, it was Lacan, and various other things, and it was incredibly intense, and I was impressed by the rigor that it demanded of the students, and students really rose to the challenge, and it was a very intense seminar. And then a number of years ago, I did a course on Heidegger's lectures on Nietzsche's eternal return. And a very different mode of writing from being in time. I mean, he delivered these lectures orally, and so they have a much more kind of pedagogical feel. And it was really exciting and difficult to do that. I've also taught Heidegger in the context of a course on poetry and philosophy, where we've read some of Heidegger's essays on Hölderlin, and read other kind of philosophers writing about Derrida and Mallarmé, Hamacher and Celan, Adorno and Celan. So that's the context in which I've been reading Heidegger. So initially, you know, when I thought I was gonna, when Jürgen very generously invited me to speak, the idea was to give a paper. And I might have actually given a paper had we been together in one room and had a chance really to interact. But for a situation like this, I just don't want to talk at you. And I really, as much as we can, to have this a kind of interactive experience and a real kind of seminar kind of discussion. So I chose a text that has the virtue of being short. So I thought people could all read it at least once before meeting, and then it would be relatively manageable to talk about. And it's also something that it's a text that has intrigued me and that I haven't worked intensively on before. So I wanted, in the true spirit of trying out ideas in a philosophy club, to work on this text together with you. So I'm feeling my way through it, and will suggest some kind of path marks and ways to get through it. But I really want to depend on you guys to help me kind of think it through. So I do want this as much as possible to be a seminar. So, but let me begin by throwing out kind of the most obvious question. And that is, first of all, a bit of context. Heidegger, after Being and Time, published in the late 20s, was becoming more and more interested in poets and thinking poetically. And what that meant took him on a very different kind of philosophical path. So the Nietzsche lectures are kind of part of that. And he'd been working on Hölderlin a lot during the Second World War, and we could talk for an entire session about Heidegger and Nazism and the rector's speech. He was a member of the party at a certain point, was head of the Frankfurt University for a year. And there's been an awful lot said about Heidegger's relationship to Nazism. And one of the reasons I taught the course on Nietzsche is he claimed years later, he said, anybody who has ears to hear will know that my resistance to the Nazi regime is contained in these lectures. And these lectures were delivered like 33 to 35. So after he had stepped down as being rector of the Freiburg University, and never officially broke with the Nazi party, but this was his claim. So I was interested in kind of pursuing that. Now, this lecture was given in Darmstadt, so in the area around, in the Bundesland of Hessen, near Frankfurt, in 1951. So 1951 is post-war period in Germany. It's still a period of relative devastation. Heidegger speaks at the end of the essay about a housing crisis, and so it's against this background of real kind of housing plight, as he calls it, that he's going to give this pretty philosophical lecture about building, dwelling, and thinking. So what's the first thing you notice about the title? Just kind of unmute yourselves and jump in.
I guess I'll start. So it seems like a pretty bold title. You know, it's very action forward. You know, it uses ing and, like, you know, bold verbs. So it catches my attention in that way.
Okay, so first of all, he uses verbs, but what's the particular term that we use for these kinds of verbs, at least in the English translation?
Infinitive, right?
Huh?
A gerund?
They're gerunds, right. And there are no commas between them, just three terms. All suggesting, as Scott said, some kind of, there are verb forms. In fact, in the German, they're not gerunds, but in the infinitive, verbs in the infinitive, which have the status also of gerunds in English. So the first question that is raised is, one, what kind of verbs are they? What's their relationship to each other? Okay, and unlike many titles, there's not one term which seems to be exactly subordinated to the others. And there doesn't seem exactly to be a sequence that goes from, say, building to dwelling, and then finally we get to thinking. In fact, remember the first sentence? This is an attempt to think about dwelling and building. He doesn't say, think about dwelling first and then build. In fact, the titles should have said, it should have been to think about building and dwelling if he had kept the sequence of the title. So he's already thinking these terms in relation to each other. And that will be one of the main concerns of this text, asking what is the relationship of dwelling and building. And also thinking will be thematized at the end, but already thinking is what one is going to do with these two terms. One is going to be thinking about them. And so first of all, the first thing he's saying is they should not be thought of as three separate things, but they have to be thought together. And the question is going to become, what kind of thinking makes this thinking together possible? Okay, pretty straightforward. The other basic question posed by the title is, they are verbs. To what extent do these verbs suggest forms of activity? Let's look, for example, on page, the whole question of activity and passivity, of activity and inactivity, is going to be a central question throughout this lecture. That's throughout Heidegger's lecture. So let's just pick it up on the top of 361 to kind of cue into his thinking about activity and passivity. Somebody want to read, as soon as we try to think of the essence of constructing building? But we all have the same pagination, right? Jürgen?
As soon as we try to think of the essence of constructive building in terms of a letting dwell, we come to know more clearly what that process of making consists in by which building is accomplished. Usually we take production to be an activity whose performance has a result, the finished structure, as its consequence. It is possible to conceive of making in that way. We thereby grasp something that is correct, and yet never touch its essence, which is a producing that brings something forth. For building brings the fourfold hither into a thing, the bridge, and brings forth the thing as a locale, out of what is already present, room for which is only now made by this locale.
Okay. It'll take us a long time to kind of build up to this paragraph so that it makes some kind of sense. But the only thing I want to alert us to and to keep our finger on is the way he's putting a certain kind of making as activity into question. And he's going to connect that to this other verb which runs through the text. In fact, it's the verb, it's a verb, but it's also kind of a helping verb. It's the verb in that first sentence in terms of letting dwell. Letting dwell. And the word letting, to leave, to let something be, to let something appear, which is going to come up in the next paragraph. Letting, the German verb is lassen, is a very curious kind of verb. And so is the activity associated with it. Because what is the difference, say, between dwelling and letting dwell?
It's not visible, dude. You're at the front.
So I just want to kind of sensitize us to this verb letting, leaving, which plays a really important role in this essay, in this text, which is very much about forms of activity which are not quite active, forms of inactivity which are not quite passive. So let's just, to kind of build a framework for our thinking today, talk about the verb let, leave, what the difference is, again, between, say, letting dwell and dwelling. Anybody?
Dwelling is, even if you, without the let, dwelling is something that we think of as passive, and it's sort of extra passive with the let, letting something dwell versus sort of actively dwelling.
Okay. So what does the let add? It reinforces that sense?
I think it reinforces that it's passive, and it sort of may remove the person who is doing the action. You can sort of dwell yourself, but if you let dwell, it might not be you that is doing the dwelling, I guess.
Okay. What else do we associate with this curious kind of verb?
I would say the term facilitator comes to mind, something that is kind of laying the groundwork for the dwelling. That's kind of, metaphorical. But
Okay. Okay. Like a lot of stuff we're going to do in a preliminary way, let's let the question work on us. Okay. But I promise you it has something to do with a different kind of activity or different relationship between activity and passivity, activity and inactivity, which is neither nor. And in fact, letting is often described as a middle word. Middle word in the sense of in the middle between active and passive. And it plays a very crucial role in this text. Now, already you can see my orientation. I don't know if it's an orientation that one would associate with somebody who works primarily in literature, but it's an orientation to the words on the page, the language, and above all, Heidegger's relationship to language. And that more than, look, I don't know what we're gonna learn today about what dwelling really is, or what dwelling's true relationship to thinking and building is. What I hope we can get a sense of is Heidegger's method, the way he goes about addressing certain issues. He has a very kind of unique way of doing so. And I think that in the time that we have, we can begin to kind of get a feel for it. And if we can do that, then we've been thinking with Heidegger, which is no mean feat. One of the most straightforward things that Heidegger says about, this is also a text about language, right? And Heidegger is going to be repeatedly speaking not in concepts per se, defining his terms, and this is, what dwelling means, but he's constantly going back to the dictionary. He's constantly looking at etymologies of where particular terms like dwelling, like building came from. And so he's interested in philology. He's interested in linguistic history. Some people have accused Heidegger of being a kind of blood and soil kind of guy, where very attached to nationalism, to rooting the German language and German identity in a kind of linguistic history. So there's a lot at stake here when we talk about if Heidegger is going to engage in this kind of etymologizing, in this kind of philological thinking. One of the kind of ideological political dangers are that he's trying to ground everything in a particular linguistic tradition, grounded, say, in the history of the German language. I think we have to, this is definitely in the air whenever we read Heidegger. But I would suggest that he's not doing that in this text. And that his philological etymologizing gestures take us in a somewhat different direction. But to get the most kind of basic sense of that, Let's go to page 348. And I want to start at the end of the top paragraph. He says, yet at the same time, by the means and schema, we block our view of the essential relations. For building is not merely a means and a way toward dwelling. To build is in itself already to dwell. And then Heidegger, who tells us this? Who gives us a standard at all by which we can measure the essence of dwelling and building? So when he is coming to, when he poses the question, who gives us the standard by which to measure these things, whether it's authentic, true, essential, dwelling, and being, he doesn't have a kind of concept in mind. He has linguistic usage in mind. He has what the history of language can tell us about this evolving relationship. So also for Heidegger, this is not about timeless essences of dwelling or of building or of thinking for that matter. These are terms that have history, terms that have a linguistic history, terms that in their shifting history reflect philosophical changes. Sometimes he'll call these changes so decisive that they become events in history, philosophical events. So the stakes here are pretty high. And his answer is, of course, language is the standard. And so let's read that next paragraph. Somebody want to read, please?
I can read it from, it is language.
Yeah.
It is language that tells us about the essence of a thing, provided that we respect language's own essence. In the meantime, to be sure, there rages around the earth an unbridled yet clever talking, writing, and broadcasting of spoken words. Man acts as though he were the shaper and master of language, while in fact language remains the master of man. Perhaps it is, before all else, man's subversion of this relation of dominance that drives his essential being into alienation. That we retain a concern for care in speaking is all to the good, but is of no help to us as long as language still serves us, even then only as a means of expression. Among all the appeals that we human beings on our part can help to be voiced, language is the highest and everywhere the first.
Okay, let's unpack this. What's the subversion here?
It feels, or it seems as though, right, the standard mode of alienation is like, oh, I have a product, something that I control that becomes reified, that becomes object-like, and in turn dominates me. Like that's kind of just a very standard understanding of Marxist alienation. And Heidegger does a funny thing. I was thinking about this mainly earlier, like this was the main thing that I was thinking about through the whole thing, in that if we aren't already in control of language, if it's in fact language that dominates us, how is it ever possible for us to be alienated from language if it's our master and we're not its master?
Heidegger's claim is that insofar as we narcissistically, anthropocentrically see ourselves as masters and language as servant in the service of a means of communication, a mere means of communicating our thoughts, man is going to be alienated from his own essence. So it's in that kind of self-important subversion that man has turned this relationship on its head. As if, as if it's like really humiliating to allow ourselves to see ourselves in the service of language, to be dominated by language, to have language have the last word about us rather than the other way around. And so Heidegger, one of the things he's doing here is acknowledging a subversion that has happened, where the pride of place has gone from language to man. And he wants in some ways to restore that, or to shift it back, and to give in some ways language its due, right? To not treat language as a means to an end, a means of communication, something in the service of man, something that man uses when he engages in unbridled yet clever talking, writing, and broadcasting of spoken words. These are all making uses of language. Heidegger's question is more, how are we used by language? And how have we How have we forgotten what language has been? What terms have come to replace other terms? And so in what ways have we lost contact with our own history? And for Heidegger, it's not just a question of having lost contact with that history, but of having, in many ways, repressed that history. That there are certain turning points in history where certain meanings have come to the fore, have been foregrounded, and other meanings have thereby been shunted into the background, right? Have been, to use Heidegger's terms, not just shunted into the background, but have been consigned to oblivion. Freud would say repressed, right? So one of the things that Heidegger is trying to make contact with again is this repressed history. Are these linguistic paths not taken? And not to kind of simply rehabilitate these terms, but to provide a kind of resonances for terms which where we've lost the full range of meaning because only certain meanings have been privileged at the expense of others. So Heidegger is trying to, in a very kind of teacherly way, trying to restore a certain kind of context, make us open our ears a little bit to paths not taken. Okay. He also is going to emphasize, particularly toward the end, particular aspects of language. He's going to talk about a structure of calls and appeals and summonses and forms of summons and calls that we are positioned to respond to answer, to correspond with. So we also have to kind of bear in mind language is not just vocabulary. It's not just, a treasure of words. Language is, in the way he's thinking about it, also involves structures of address, claims that are placed on us, calls, and calls to which we are summoned to respond. So that's another aspect of language we're going to have to focus on. He's also further on, and again to kind of get our bearings, toward the very end, he's going to talk about building and thinking at the bottom of 362. And let's just kind of read that into the mix at this point. building and thinking are each in its own way. You guys have the passage? Amy, you got it? You want to read it?
Yeah, sure. Building and thinking are, each in its own way, inescapable for dwelling. The two, however, are also insufficient for dwelling so long as each busies itself with its own affairs in separation, instead of listening to the other. They are able to...
Well, that's it. That's it. So each busies itself with its own affairs in separation, instead of listening to each other. It's kind of a weird way to put things. What's he suggesting here? Since when is it necessary that thinking and building, particularly in the context of dwelling, it's insufficient for them to busy themselves in their own business. In other words, to dwell only in separate matters. Instead, it's necessary, he says, for them to listen to each other. So this is a text not only about language as speaking or language as vocabulary or philology, but this is a text about listening and cultivating a different kind of listening. Cultivated a different ear for hearing things, and I'd suggest an ear in particular for particular kinds of resonances, and the way these, and ultimately to hear the interrelationship of these three terms in a way that historically has been shut down for us. And one of the things Heidegger is going to try to do is reopen those passageways, allow them to communicate with each other, and strangely enough, to listen to each other.
Excuse me?
Yeah, Helen.
My name is Helen. I was just thinking about the term dwelling. It can be both applied to building and thinking. I can dwell in a thought, I can dwell in an idea, or I can live in a dwelling, right? It's another term for house. So if you think about it that way, would that be like another way to think about that sentence that you just read? The quote, the two, however, are also insufficient for dwelling, so long as each busies itself with its own affairs in separation. So if you think about dwelling as being part of both terms, would that make more sense in terms of understanding what Heidegger is trying to proclaim?
Yeah, I think, your instincts are good to think about these terms in their colloquial usage as turns of phrase. For example, to dwell on an idea. I think that's really important, and something we should bear in mind and see how Heidegger does that at certain points. Because if nothing else, one of the important resonances of the word to dwell, and here, how many of you know German, or have a bit of German? Okay, so what is the German word for dwelling?
Wohnen.
Wohnen, right. And something that is habitual is what in German? It comes up in the context of this essay. Das Gewohnte. Eine Gewohnheit is what is a habit, something habitual. And so this is in English, you can kind of make the connection through habitation and habituation. Right? But one of the things, to come back to your point, Helen, about if we're going to think about dwelling, for Heidegger, dwelling is related to habitation, which is itself related to habits. And what makes habits so hard to think is that they're so habitual. They're so ingrained in our ways of thinking. They're habits so ingrained in our language that we don't have the distance to look at them. right? We have to develop a kind of dehabituation. But one of the things that he is suggesting is precisely what you said, that there is etymologically a connection between habitation and habituation, between wohnen and das Gewohnte. So he's also implicitly asking us to think about our habits of thought. And by extension, how we dwell in them, or how they dwell in us. How we are creatures of habit, which is to say, we are inhabited by them in ways that are largely ingrained, largely kind of taken for granted. So he's engaging throughout this text in a process of kind of defamiliarization. And one of his ways to defamiliarize is to go back to through these etymological forays into the paths not taken, into the terms, into the meanings that these terms once had, but then language went in another direction. And the way he does that most obviously is through the word building. The German word for building is what?
Bauen.
Bauen, right. And again, one has to think in Heidegger always of kind of word clusters. You know, there's never kind of a single word which means just this. It's always enmeshed in a network of signifiers. So when he's talking about building, eventually he will get to the all too familiar notion of building as construction, right? Of erecting something, of putting up a building. But it takes him a long time to get there. And one of the reasons it takes him so long is because he knows how familiar that term is, and he knows how much in the foreground it is, and how much it blinds us and eclipses all the other terms. And what he wants to do is to kind of shrink the importance of that foreground word and let the other resonances come back into the picture. And so one of the ways he's going to do that is through, and forgive the kind of constant recourse to the German, but in German, the phrase for tilling the soil, anybody know? It's Ackerbau, which has the word bauen, bau, in it, right? Another word that is important to him is Weinbau, which, anybody know what Weinbau is? Weinbau. The cultivation of the vine, right? So so bauen has to do not just with putting up buildings, but Heidegger, you know, is interestingly never talking about subways or underground structures. Building is always something that is above ground and reaches toward the sky, just as the cultivation of the vine and the tilling of the soil are also processes of bauen that help things grow, right? That it's not a making, again, that question of making and producing, but of a kind of nurturing, right? Of helping things kind of do what they do otherwise, which is to kind of grow upward and grow naturally. The other reason he's interested, so let's go back to, he's finally getting into Bauen.
Professor?
Yes, sir.
Can I ask you a brief question? It sounds like whenever Heidegger is talking about building, there's always this kind of positive aspect to it. Are we ever building walls and prisons?
Not in this essay, no. Good point. No, no. I think that he's not ignorant of such forms of building, but I think that all those kind of buildings are building in the sense of construction and of an edifice. And he wants to kind of pull that back a little bit in order to kind of make space for other less audible notions of building. Just as, you know, the sense of dwelling, which he comes back to at the end, in terms of speaking about contemporary housing crisis. I mean, he's aware of these pressing contemporary issues, and in some ways, because he's Heidegger and somewhat arrogant, he thinks that these are somehow less important than kind of recapturing these other eclipsed traditions in thinking, and particularly in Western thinking, that he would, if not like to restore, at least to get us to flesh out and think about once again. So let's go back to the first thing he does with the root bauen is he sees it in relation to the word neighbor, right? On page 349. Let's pick it up bottom of 348, top of 349. Again, all we're doing here is building context. So now, what does bauen, to build, mean? Somebody want to? Helen, are you by any chance related to Beamtwitte and the other famous German Wittes? No? Okay. I had to ask. Great Benjamin scholar is Beamtwitte.
I can ask my family, but I doubt it.
Okay.
Been in America for a while, so.
Okay. Good. It's an unusual name, and I had to ask. Okay, bottom of 348. Somebody want to read, please?
I can read again.
Amy, go ahead.
Now, what does bauen, to build, mean? The Old High German word for building, bauen, means to dwell. This signifies to remain, to stay in a place. The proper meaning of the verb bauen, namely to dwell, has been lost to us, but a covert trace of it has been preserved in the German word Nachbar, neighbor. The Nachbar is the Nachgeber, forgive my pronunciation, the Nachgebauer, the near dweller, he who dwells nearby. The verbs buri, buren, buron all signify dwelling, the place of dwelling. Now, to be sure, the old word bauen not only tells us that bauen, to build, is really to dwell, it also gives us a clue as to how we have to think about the dwelling it signifies. When we speak of dwelling, we usually think of an activity that man performs alongside many other activities. We work here and dwell there. We do not merely dwell, that would be virtual inactivity. We practice a profession, we do business, we travel and find shelter on the way, now here, now there. Bauen originally means to dwell.
Okay, let's pause there. Thank you. So what's his point? I mean, there are a few points here, but what about, we started out with these three terms, building, dwelling, thinking. What turns out to be the relationship between building and dwelling? All right, so the mediation of the term neighbor, right? Ne as in nigh, as in near, as in next to, right? That's all clear. Neighborhood, but he's picking up on the ber, right? Nachba. And he says ba comes from the root bauen. But it doesn't mean bauen in the sense of building, but rather
Dwelling.
Right. So first, obvious move is that building and dwelling are not distinct terms here. That Bowen originally meant dwelling. And then the question for him becomes, what does it mean to dwell? What kind of dwelling? Is dwelling an activity next to other activities, to nearby activities, to neighboring activities? And so he compares it to, he says, we work here and dwell there. He's setting us up here. For what? Working is an activity, right? Undisputed.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, there originally seems to be a kind of separation between like the inactivity dwelling and then the activity of working and doing and building.
Right.
And that's like colloquially how we think of the two terms in relation to one another, but it turns out to be much more something along the lines of like a form. Dwelling is when we do things, when we perform a profession and go to work and then come back home, that is what dwelling actually is. And so dwelling is almost this thing in which we do work or build.
I think you're falling into the opposition that he is trying to undermine. I mean, exactly, I think what he's saying is we go to work, we come home from work, and we put our feet up, we become inactive, and in doing that, we're dwelling. And that's way too passive and inactive a sense of dwelling for what he has in mind, right? So it can't simply be contrasted or opposed to working. And so again, the enigma here is what dwelling is an activity, but it's a different kind of activity. An activity maybe that looks like inactivity, but has something much more active going on. That's why I wanted us to focus on that word let, leave, and so on, because it's neither active nor passive. Letting something be, letting something appear. Very different kind of activity. It can be a delegation. It can be a kind of cultivation and nurturing, a letting something come into its own. Let them speak, for example. What kind of doing is that? It's often a kind of hold back, or it's a kind of support. Make speech possible for that person. Okay, so that's one sense of. So he's begun by saying, "Oh, we thought we had three terms here, but to build is actually, in the kind of old sense of the term, a sense that's still carried by words like neighbor, dwelling." Right? So the kind of what's Heidegger's linguistic move here? Why, in order to make his point, does he pick up on a word like neighbor?
Well, you don't think of your neighbor. I mean, the neighbor is the near dweller, not the near builder. And I think that's a word in which, like, the colloquial usage still tracks the old meaning of the root,
right?
Of the root of Bauman.
Good. So he's found a kind of a lot of the connection between building and dwelling has been forgotten. It's disappeared. But there's a kind of faint, thin thread which we can still tease out of the word neighbor that kind of reminds us of that relationship. So I think that's one of the reasons that, in a meta way, why these he's taking familiar terms and again defamiliarizing them, tracing back their linguistic history in order to restore something that might have gotten forgotten. Do you guys hear that outside? It's 7 o'clock in New York. Anybody know what that means? What happens every night at 7 o'clock? Mercedes. Every night at 7 o'clock, the entire city opens its windows and bangs on pots and pans and claps and yells and screams in support of first responders and to say to each other, we're here and we're here for each other. We're here in our neighborhood and for our neighbors. It's a moment I really love. It's one of the few moments in this incredibly isolating life that we've been living that feels like community. And we're fucking New Yorkers. Okay, back to Heidegger. Okay, the next move that he makes, and another really important reason that he's interested in the word bauen, is because of its, the other connection that we're gonna pick up on here. Amy, you wanna read on? That is bauen, bu, beo, on page 349.
Yeah. I'm trying to, where? Sorry, where?
Middle of the page.
That is bauen, bu, beo. Our word bin in the versions ich bin, I am, du bist, you are. The imperative form bis, be. What then does ich bin mean? The old word bauen, to which the bin belongs, answers ich bin, du bist, mean I dwell, you dwell. The way in which
let's just pause there. What has he also teased out of bauen, which is absolutely important for Heidegger, who wrote, this book on being in time, right? What has he discovered in bauen?
to be.
To be, yeah, right. So now the question, so bauen, building is related to dwelling, and it's related to being. And so the question for Heidegger in turn becomes, in a very kind of logical way, okay, if I am dwelling, where do I dwell? What kind of dwelling do I have? So it's not, what does it mean to dwell, but where do I dwell? And what's his answer?
Some buildings are dwellings and some are not.
No. So he's talking about ich bin, I am. So where I as a human being, where do I be? Where on the earth, right? And on the earth as what kind of being? Mortal being. Two incredibly important predicates, right? Dwelling means being on the earth, dwelling on the earth as a mortal. Now, why is that important? Where's he going to go with that? And I'm going to have to kind of speed up a little bit if we're going to move ahead. But of course, being on the earth for Heidegger doesn't simply, being on the earth as a mortal also means necessarily, if you're dwelling on the earth,
sky above you,
you're dwelling under the sky above you. And what is the sky? What is above us in the sky?
Mortals, gods.
Gods, right, divinity. For Heidegger, then he's already moving us into this very famous, though enigmatic notion of what he calls the fourfold. And the fourfold is the thinking together as one, what he calls the onefold. Another word for onefold is simplex, right? Or einfältig. A simpleton is someone who only has one fold in his brow, whereas the man or woman of great thought and maturity has many folds in the brow. Anyway, he's thinking about these four things brought together in what he calls a onefold, or the fourfold in one. So, in other words, to think dwelling on the earth, you also have to think of dwelling under the star, under the sky. To dwell as a mortal is also to dwell with the gods, with the divinity. So that's the fourfold: mortal, divine, on the earth, in the sky, or on the earth, under the sky, right? Those four things always have to be thought together. Again, not separately, but the way they listen to each other and have to be heard in relation to each other, into their essential interaction, interpenetration, right? That's why it's fourfold, it's manifold. It's these four things always working through each other, implicated in each other, folded into and through each other. And he's going to spend a certain amount of time unfolding this fourfold in the next few pages. And if you want, we can go through that. It's basically pages 351 through 353. And it's often the same move. Let's just to get a sense of it, pick it up on 352. Mortals dwell in that they save the earth. And what does he mean here by saving the earth? What I love about Heidegger is he always kind of offers you the commonplace definition. It's like, of course, you know what saving is, but that's not what I mean by saving. Amy?
He says it's to set something free.
Pardon me?
He says, sorry, my mic is not, to set something free.
Let's read it. Mortals dwell in that they save the earth.
Okay. Mortals dwell in that they save the earth, taking the word in the old sense still known to Lessing. Saving does not only snatch something from a danger, to save...
That's what we usually think of as saving, right? Yeah. Like a lifeguard.
To save properly means to set something free into its own essence. To save the...
Set something free is, the German is freilassen. Let something be free. To release it. To let it go into its own essence. That's why this lassen word is all over the place. Amy.
To save the earth is more than to exploit it or even wear it out. Saving the earth does not master the earth and does not subjugate it, which is merely one step from boundless spoliation. Mortals dwell in that they receive the sky as sky. They leave to the sun and the moon their journey, to the stars their courses, to the seasons their blessing and their inclemency. They do not turn night into day, nor day into a harassed unrest.
Again, the let word, they leave to the sun, right? They let it be. These are not relationships. What would be the opposite of these leave words? They'd be relationships of domination, subjugation, mastery, right? These are all like the counterpoints for the kind of leaving and letting that he's talking about. Okay, and then mortals dwell.
Mortals dwell in that they await the divinities as divinities. In hope, they hold up to the divinities what is unhoped for. They wait for intimations of their coming and do not mistake the signs of their absence. They do not make their gods for themselves and do not worship idols. In the very depth of misfortune, they wait for the wheel that has been withdrawn.
I mean, well, let's just pause there. This is very interesting kind of Heideggerian theology here. So what are mortals' relationship to the divine, according to Heidegger, to the divinities? What does their kind of dwelling entail with regard to the divine?
I mean, he says that they wait for that.
They wait.
And they don't try to, I guess, superimpose or impose any kind of anything onto them.
So this is not like groups that hasten the coming of the Messiah. They wait. They wait for what is unhoped for. They wait for what is unhoped for. Like you can't even hope for it in this relation to the divine. It's not a hopeful relationship. In some ways, it's, he has an essay on Hölderlin, Wozu Dichter in dürftigen Zeiten? What are poets for in desperate times? And desperate times are, for Heidegger, the time between the departure of the gods and their possible return. So the idea of divinity here is the gods. One of the reasons the gods are up in the sky, in the constellations, way far away from us, is that they have departed. They're no longer with us.
Can you repeat the German of the quote about desperate times?
Wozu Dichter in dürftigen Zeiten.
Thanks.
And there's a famous essay by Heidegger on that. Okay, but they wait for intimations of their coming. So again, what kind of waiting is this? Waiting for intimations.
Well, it's almost a waiting because waiting is already a step removed from the thing you're waiting from, but this is like 2 steps removed. You're not even waiting for the thing itself. You're waiting for a sign of the thing.
Right. And so waiting for signs, what are you doing when you're waiting for signs? I mean, you're reading. Huh? You're reading auguries. You're reading. You're trying to kind of. Was that a sign? Was that something a sign perhaps of their coming? It's a kind of attentiveness. It's waiting in the sense not of expectation, but maybe a kind of expectancy, to a kind of welcoming, a kind of openness to what might come. Might come even though, I can't even hope for it. Okay, I say all this to give you a sense of how Heidegger is going to go through various aspects of this fourfold, right? Between mortals and gods, between mortals and the earth, between earth and sky, and kind of playing out the various kind of permutations here. Okay, we've finished part 1, which considering, so we spent an hour on like 5 pages. How are we doing? We could stop here. We could continue. We can cut to the chase and look at the very end and leave it there. You tell me, what do you guys want to do?
I don't know if my vote has any sway or not, but I was honestly just really interested in Heidegger's notion of the bridge as like a thing, like a specific thing that constitutes the extensive space around it. And I mean, that's kind of what I was most interested in this essay.
Okay. You guys want to, let's go there for a few minutes. And again, I'm less interested in like what the payoff is Heidegger's way of thinking through these issues and introducing these issues and taking a very concrete construction now, like a bridge. And as always with Heidegger, his examples are extremely well chosen, right? So the focus here on bridges is telling in many ways. So the first reason he seems to be interested in it is as an example of a construction. So let's read what he says about bridges, and let's start with the top of 354. Somebody want to read that paragraph? Jürgen, go ahead.
The bridge swings over the stream with ease and power. It does not just connect banks that are already there. The banks emerge as banks only as the bridge crosses the stream. The bridge expressly causes them to lie across from each other.
Okay, let's just pause there. What's the move?
What makes the banks banks is the fact that they're separated by a bridge, which draws attention to that.
Just separated?
That separation. Or they're connected by a bridge. They're connected by a bridge, and that's what draws attention to their former separation.
Right. So they weren't banks before there was something between them. So it's the building of the bridge, which also then builds a bridge between these two terms, which constitutes them in the first place, right? So in some ways, the banks are being constructed by the construction of the bridge, which only causes them to lie across from each other in the first place, right? The bridge builds a relation. So it's not like something pre-existing to which a bridge is added, but the addition transforms the things into banks in the first place. It's a move he will perform over and over again. What appears to be secondary and added on to something pre-existing will turn out to have been something that had either been made a place for in the original, or that in coming about in a seemingly secondary way will bring the seemingly primary into existence, right? So he's playing throughout with before and after, something appearing to be pre-existing and something which is secondary and supplemental. I mean, Derrida's notion of the supplement comes in many ways from Heidegger. Let's read on.
One side is set off against the other by the bridge. Nor do the banks stretch along the stream as indifferent border strips of the dry land. With the banks, the bridge brings to the stream the one and the other expanse of the landscape lying behind them. It brings stream and bank and land into each other's neighborhood. The bridge gathers the earth as landscape around the stream. Thus it guides and attends the stream through the meadows. Resting upright in the stream's bed, the bridge piers bear the swing of the arches that leave the stream's water to run their course. The waters may wander on quiet and gay. The sky's floods from storm or thaw may shoot past the piers in torrential waves. The bridge is ready for the sky's weather and its fickle nature. Even where the bridge covers the stream, it holds its flow up to the sky by taking it for a moment under the vaulted gateway and then setting it free once more.
Let's read on.
The bridge lets the stream run its course, and at the same time it grants mortals their way, so that they may come and go from shore to shore. Bridges initiate in many ways. The city bridge leads from the precincts of the castle to the cathedral square. The river bridge near the country town brings wagons and horse teams to their surrounding villages. The old stone bridge's humble brook crossing gives to the harvest wagons its passage from the fields into the village and carries the lumber carts from their field path to the road. The highway bridge is tied into a network of long-distance traffic, paced and calculated for maximum yield. Always and ever differently, the bridge initiates the lingering and hastening ways of men to and fro, so that they may get to other banks and in the end, as mortals, to the other side. Now in a high arch, now in a low, the bridge vaults over glen and stream, whether mortals keep in mind this vaulting of the bridge's course or forget that they, having themselves on their way to the last bridge, are actually striving to surmount all that is common and unsound in them in order to bring themselves before the haleness of the divinities. The bridge gathers as a passage that crosses before the divinities. Whether we explicitly think of and visibly give thanks for their presence, as in the figure of the saint of the bridge, or whether that divine presence is obstructed or even pushed wholly aside. The bridge gathers to itself in its own way, earth and sky, divinities and mortals.
Okay, and here's the payoff.
Gathering, Versammlung, by an ancient word of our language, is called thing. The bridge is a thing, and indeed, it is such as the gathering of the fourfold which we have described. To be sure, people think of the bridge as primarily and properly merely a bridge. After that, and occasionally, it might possibly express much else besides, and as such an expression, it would then become a symbol, for instance, a symbol of those things we mentioned before. But the bridge, if it is truly a bridge, is never first of all a mere bridge and then afterward a symbol. And just as little is the bridge in the first place exclusively a symbol, in the sense that it expresses something that strictly speaking does not belong to it. If we take the bridge strictly as such, it never appears as an expression. The bridge is a thing and only that. Only as this thing it gathers the fourfold.
And let's finish up with this last paragraph.
Sure. Our thinking has, of course, long been accustomed to understate the essence of the thing. The consequence, in the course of Western thought, has been that the thing is represented as an unknown X to which perceptible properties are attached. From this point of view, everything that already belongs to the gathering essence of this thing does, of course, appear as something that is afterward read into it. Yet the bridge would never be a mere bridge if it were not a thing.
Okay, let's take some time to unpack this, what he's doing here. What jumps out at you? First of all, there's a move that's made on page 354 in that bottom paragraph. He's been talking about bridges and streams and banks, and then he goes through city bridges and country bridges and even bridges on the Autobahn, highway bridges, before he gets to another bridge.
The bridge to the immortals.
Yes, and what is that bridge? What is the bridge from mortals to?
The divinity.
Not sure it's the divinity. He says, always and ever differently, the bridge initiates the lingering and hastening ways of men to and fro, so that they may get to the other bank, to the other banks, and in the end, as mortals, to the other side. what does it mean for mortals to get to the other side?
From life to death.
Right, right. Crossing the bridges, instead of the ferryman Charon ferrying across the river Styx into the underworld or into death. It's now the bridge joining and separating man from death, right? The question, and then he's going to continue to riff on this, always themselves on their way to the last bridge, which is to say, man's being unto death. That for Heidegger, this is related to his notion of finitude, mortality. For Heidegger, there's no afterlife. When you dead, you dead. So there's no theology of resurrection, of kind of this world in view of the next world. That's not Heidegger. So, yes.
Just a quick question for you. If there's no afterlife for Heidegger, then what's the other bank that you're making it to? It would seem like you don't get past that river, or it wouldn't seem like you get across that bridge if there's nowhere to get across to.
I think that when he says always themselves on their way to the last bridge, that's that sense of life in view of death. And that other side is death, but without death as a form of life, death as afterlife. It's like the other side is just death. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
For me, death seems like nothing. Seems like nothingness.
Yeah.
And so it seems like if I was going to go to the bank of death, the bank of nothing, a bank of nothing is not a bank. And so I'm not quite able to visualize how we're going to get to this bank that doesn't exist.
Excellent. I mean, so this is one of the moments where we were building bridges from kind of one sense of bridge to another, and thinking the other side on the model of a bridge over water, right, with banks on each side. And now I think he's breaking with that metaphorical chain in order to introduce another side which is not the symmetrical counterpart to this side. I think he's introducing something new, not by the extension of the metaphor, but precisely where it breaks down. I think that's what's going on here. Vaughn, and then Amy, and then Helen.
Yeah, this passage was really fun for me in that it kind of performs the very topology that he's trying to lay out. Like, he has this bridge and it leads us here, and then it leads us down a road, and then it leads us to the pasture, and then it leads us like to another bridge, and then we cross that bridge. And there's a way that you can imagine Heidegger essentially going on forever, like with this kind of like endless and another and another and another. And so, I don't know, death almost functions like the way it's supposed to in like here as like a definitive stopping point that allows us to actually continue. Like it's like I don't know, a quilting point, like an end point, and which sort of lets us get past this just infinite slipping and sliding and motion.
Or he's building bridges, from one kind to the other, and you're kind of, okay, I get it, and then boom, like the bridge somehow collapses.
Yeah.
The metaphor breaks down. Amy?
I feel like my question might be a little redundant now, but I was going to ask about then if that's what the function of the term gathers is as a kind of as a solution to this problem of the bridge metaphor breaking down. Because to me, bridge implies a certain directionality, right? Which is, I think, the problem that Joseph was pointing out, right? You're crossing, but the thing to which you're supposed to be arriving at supposedly doesn't exist, right? Because you're dead and there's nothing. But gathering to me feels more of like a meeting point of things, of multiple things.
I mean, gathering has that sense of like the simplex, where the fourfold is gathered together. Where in order, the gathering in the sense that if you're going to think on the earth, you have to think it under the sky. If you're going to think mortal on the earth, you have to think mortal in relation to the divinity. And all these different terms as mutually conditioning. That's the notion of gathering. So it's formally distinct things that are gathered into and through each other. That's the sense of gathering. But the question here is, we seem to be dealing with literal bridges, and then we get to a metaphorical bridge. Like we don't usually think about the bridge to death. And yet that's what he's suggesting here, right? Man, the bridge to the other side. And so implicitly what's at stake here is the relationship between literal and figurative. Proper sense of bridge and bridge in an extended metaphorical sense. And in the passage on page 355, he's going to take up precisely this question. And before getting to it, I want to give Helen a chance to speak.
Hello. Thank you. I just was wondering why would Heidegger believe in the divine, to divinities, but not in heaven? So where do the divine reside then? They reside in the sky, but the sky isn't heaven.
The sky is the heavens, but I don't think it's a good question. I don't think it's part of some kind of afterlife or no, the language that we read about the divinities is, we're not going to them. We're not going up to the heavens after death. The best case scenario, we're waiting for them to come back to us.
Right.
So it works, I think, only in that direction, that the departed may return. Okay, let's take up, and I don't know about you guys, I'm fading a little bit. Let's pick it up on 355 and think about this relationship we were just talking about in terms of literal and figurative, so-called proper meaning of bridge to extended metaphorical notion of bridge. And let's see the way Heidegger deals with that apparent extension. Jürgen?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a very quick comment, which was I liked when he said that it brings stream and bank and land into each other's neighborhood, thereby going back to like Nachbar, and that made me understand what he was saying earlier when he said that like such buildings as bridges and whatnot were in the domain of dwelling, even if they aren't themselves dwelling places. But yeah.
So they dwell together. And that, Amy, is the kind of gathering we're talking about, that they dwell together, but not like as roommates and not necessarily in the same place, but they are being thought together as in their proximity to each other, but they're not merely close in the sense of nearness. They're interpenetrating. They inform each other in essential ways, right? So there are no they're not separate and spaced out. They're folded into each other. And this idea of the fold, you have to think it also use our linguistic resonances to think of fold as the root pli, P-L-I, which is the French word for fold. And from that we get implicated, folded, literally folded into each other, folded like batter through each other. This is the kind of enfolding that he's talking about here. All right, maybe to conclude, let's go on to this paragraph on 355. Let's read it again. Gathering, Versammlung. Somebody want to read it again? Please.
I got it. Gathering, by an ancient word of our language, is called thing. The bridge is a thing, and indeed is such as the gathering of the furfolds which we have described. To be sure, people think of the bridge as primarily and properly merely a bridge. After that, and occasionally, it might possibly express much else besides.
Okay, let's just pause there. So what would, in our context, what would be the much else besides? What would be the merely a bridge, the properly a bridge, primarily a bridge, and what would then be the possibly much else besides?
Like the bridge from life to death, like a metaphorical or figurative bridge.
Precisely. So he's setting us up here once again, right? To say, you guys, you believe in properness. You believe in a proper meaning. You believe in the literal. You believe in, as if there were ever such thing as merely a bridge, to which the human bridge to death would be an add-on, would be an extended sense, a metaphorical kind of extrapolation from the proper, right? This is where he's going to turn things around again. So let's read on. Daniel, were you reading?
Sure. And as such an expression, it would then become a symbol. For instance, a symbol of those things we mentioned before. But the bridge, if it is a true bridge, is never first of all a mere bridge, and then afterward a symbol. And just as little is the bridge in the first place exclusively a symbol, in the sense that it expresses something that strictly speaking does not belong to it. If we take the bridge strictly as such, it never appears as an expression. The bridge is a thing and only that. Only as this thing, it gathers the fourfold.
Somebody want to paraphrase this or unpack it?
Professor, I don't mean to be so literal again, but I see a bridge as a connection between 2 points. But here we're talking about a bridge as a connection between 4 points. I'm not seeing how a bridge does that.
Good. I think the relationship here is between something which was a mere bridge, which then afterward became a bridge to death, right? And Heidegger is putting that in question. And what he's saying is the bridge was always more than we literally, merely, properly took it to be. This bridge over water was always to be thought of in terms of man's relationship to death. But he's making the larger point here. Joseph, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to say, if maybe what you're saying and he's saying, if I'm understanding it even closely right, is that we're talking about physical bridges, we're talking about metaphysical bridges, and once we start talking about different types of bridges, now we're talking about different numbers of bridges, and once we have a quantity of bridges, we can connect a quantity of points that go beyond 2. No, that's not it.
No. I think drop the bridges. drop the number of bridges.
Yeah.
The essential relationship here is between the way we think about the literal and the figurative, between the proper sense, the proper meaning, and the extended meaning. What he's doing is putting into question the traditional notion of metaphor. That metaphor is a carrying over of a characteristic from its proper. When you say Achilles is a lion, you're taking the property of courage from the lion and carrying it over to Achilles to make him like a lion, right? But you've basically the transfer of, and metaphor means transport, right? The transfer is from a literal proper place to an extended sense. That's traditional relationship of primary and secondary, where the metaphor is always added on from without. He's subverting that relationship and saying that from the beginning, the latter was already gathered into the former, and the former was already beyond itself. In other words, there was no proper sense, no literal sense in the first place. It was already contaminated by what appears to have been added onto it. In other words, it was already metaphorical. And this is what Heidegger's been doing all the time from the very beginning of this lecture. He said, oh, we thought we knew what building was. Building was, a construction. And then it turns out it has this much broader range of resonance involving being, involving dwelling, involving wine, viniculture, and tilling the soil. I mean, this whole thing has developed a whole kind of network of associations which undermine any alleged literal sense. I think that's the big payoff here.
Is the source of ever confusion on our part or ambiguity on its part?
What's ambiguous, or what appears ambiguous?
In the sense that there was something that we didn't understand, in the sense that there was something that we were adding on to it in error. And I'm asking, is it our fault? Is there a fault here?
Okay, if there's a fault, I think that we have to go back to habitation and habituation, right? The different senses of dwelling. That we have become habituated through the history of Western thought, really beginning with Plato, to think about a subject and predicate, or something with various attributes around it. But we've also been accustomed, we've become habituated to thinking about the relationship, say, of literal and figurative sense in this particular way. And Heidegger is working against this tradition. And he's brushing this tradition against the grain. In some ways, he's trying to subvert that tradition because, according to Heidegger, Western tradition has taken us along paths of thought which we have taken to be inevitable, or because that's where we are now, that had to have been the best path. And he's going back to other forks in the road, to other paths not taken, to things that have been forgotten, repressed, and he's trying to make contact with them in order to kind of reinvigorate contemporary philosophical thinking. to kind of nurture it and nourish it in ways, because it's been depleted by a very kind of narrow for him way of thinking. And part of the narrowness is to think literal before figurative, to think merely the bridge beyond it becoming bridge to death. So he very self-consciously, and he was the one who invented the term, destroying or deconstructing this relationship by putting what appears to be, and what we think as being coming afterward and being secondary, and kind of putting it in the beginning, which is in a simple way to say everything for Heidegger is and was from the beginning metaphorical. And that as for Nietzsche, something that appears literal has lost its metaphoricity. I forget the exact quote. Jürgen.
Another way to think about this is to think of it in comparison to there's 4 really nice paragraphs before that all ended in, like, when we say sky, we're already thinking of the other 3 along with it, but we give no thought to the simple oneness of the 4. Like, it's a bridge, but it's not like merely a bridge. It's not merely a literal bridge and then secondarily a metaphorical one. It's not primarily a metaphorical one and then secondarily a literal one. There's it's like there's a folding over. It's like layers, and it's all of those things at once.
Right. Can I suggest that Helen?
Thank you. So I could think of interdependence. So the web of interdependence in Buddhism, you could kind of think of that as well, right? So Jürgen, thank you. Jürgen, it doesn't, not just one thing. It's not just the other. It's intertwined.
Yeah.
And so, I've mainly focused on in philosophy, Eastern philosophy, and not so much Western and German. So it's just very interesting to see that connection of interdependence and intertwining.
Yeah, I think it's, and intertwining with the added twist in the twine that none of these threads was itself before this interrelationship. Each, like the bank wasn't a bank until there was a bridge, right? There's not even a thread that can be wound around the other threads, because each of those threads become what they are through this interrelationship, through this. In the beginning, there was intertwining. Which, intertwining of what? Well, the various things that are being intertwined are defined by this mutually defining relationship, interrelationship. Jürgen.
Yeah, it also sounds like he's taking a real stab at, especially at the time, like the contemporary analytic philosophy and and logical positivism, especially when talking about like controlling language and how we think of language in our service, whatnot.
Right. Yeah. Guys, can we adjourn here? Adjourn means like maybe there'll be another day to continue this or some other format. I certainly hope so. It was a real challenge and pleasure thinking with you today. And I, as I said, I'm grateful for the invitation, and I hope we have a chance to do it again under other circumstances, perhaps in more neighborly, intimate setting, and to continue to think together, which was a real pleasure today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Levine.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Very quick question that's not really academic.
Amy?
So it won't take too much thought. Did you pick this text because we're all stuck in our houses? We're all dwelling very hard right now. But my assumption was, yeah. Okay.
All right, have a good night, guys.
Cool.
Bye.
See ya. Right on. This was fun.
I guess bye, Jürgen. That was fun.
Yeah,
I guess bye. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
It's nice to see Professor Levine again.
Yeah, I bet. He was Vaughn said it was really nice to see him too.
Yeah, he and I have been texting about. I'll tell you later. Okay.
Yeah, cool.
I'm gonna
Okay.
go. Bye.
See you everyone. See you Danny, see you Helen. See you Mercedes.